sometimes people will mention like, how is one supposed to understand this? And the answer
Yeah.
is kind of, you're not. I mean, it's really, you can think of it as like a conlang whose purpose is to create music rather than
Yeah.
directly to communicate. It's not music for the purpose of communication. It's music that happens to communicate something, sort of.
Welcome to Conlangery, the podcast about constructed languages and the people who create them. I'm George Corley, and with me in the great state of Connecticut is Jonathan of Musiclanging.
Yeah,
um, so, how are you doing, Jonathan?
I'm good. How are you?
Uh,
It's
that
yeah,
doing pretty great.
good.
We're going to talk to Jonathan a little bit about musical conlangs. They have created a conlang called Sdefa
Mm-hmm.
that is very nice to listen to, and
Oh,
then
thank you.
has created another musical language that is not so nice to listen to. And I think we'll
It
talk a
depends.
little bit of both.
Yes.
So, Jonathan, for our listeners, um,
Yes.
in case they don't know you, can you introduce yourself a bit about your background, and a bit about how you got into conlanging?
Yeah, I am sort of a member of the Langtime Studio side of conlanging. I've been a follower of theirs for a while. I sort of had been doing conlang stuff for a while, but it was watching those live streams that sort of got me into actually talking about that online and joining the community of conlangers. Um, I'm also a musician. I have been playing, violin and then viola and also a little bit of piano since I was 7 years old. So it's sort of, and I also compose. So it really always felt very natural to me that I would combine those two interests. Um, but as far as how I got into conlanging in the first place, it's sort of three-ish parts. So the first was when I was 8 or 9. I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and that sort of sparked the language interest in that way, which I know is a very common story.
Very common, yes.
Yes. So I mean, I know I also did, I made fantasy maps and things like that, came up with names for places. I have no idea. I'm sure those papers are still there somewhere. But I sort of that trailed off after a while, and then when I was in college, my freshman year, I noticed a friend of mine writing something in a notebook that was, not any script I recognized, and she told me that it was some script she had come up with for taking notes, and I said, "Oh, that's a really fun idea. I should do that too." So it was sort of like the way I got back into conlanging was through making scripts, which initially were just for writing in English. And the
Mhm.
very first one I did at that point, I still have memorized. I could use that if I wanted to, but it's just like a cipher for the Latin alphabet. It's got 26 characters and
Did,
basic punctuation.
so did that one start as something similar to shorthand, where like it was like simple characters to write fast, or?
Yes, very much so. So it's all a connected script. Every word is a single stroke. Um,
Hmm.
and it's also kind of, I mean, it's a dyslexic's worst nightmare because every single character, if you flip it this way, is a different character. If you flip it the other way, is a different character. If you rotate it 180 degrees, is different. It's very like efficient in that it uses all the possibilities for a very small number of shapes.
Yeah, yeah.
um so after that, I sort of continued making alphabets, like, and I must have mentioned this at some point to my sister, who was at that point in her final year of an English major, and she was taking a linguistics class, and she said, "Oh, would you like to try to make a language together?" So my first actual conlang was a collaboration with my sister, um, and it was very apparent very early on that I was much more interested in the whole thing than she was. I sort of took over the project and kept going from there.
That is an interesting story, that you started by collaborating with somebody, because
Yeah.
like for such a long time, conlanging has been seen as sort of a solitary affair,
Hmm.
and it still is for a lot of people. I think that there's a lot more collaboration, especially now that we have in the YouTube area. We've got two of with I mean, like, I'm I I'm solo, right? But then you have Langtime Studio is David and Jesse,
Hmm.
and they, of course, behind the scenes, they're working on everything together, all their contracts and stuff together.
Right.
And then Let's Have a Booba is Jake and Miles. Um, Madeline just like partners with whoever's available for her, I guess.
Hmm.
and uh, and so it is interesting that we are getting more like collaboration on things.
Hmm.
I started one at the World Building Festival with Nikolai.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's that is interesting that you started with a collaboration and then
Hmm.
you sort of went off on your own. Um, Tell me about like your early conlangs versus like how did your early conlanging stuff evolve to you eventually going to Stefa? Because I imagine that you started with conventional like oral languages
Oh, yeah,
and then
absolutely.
later
There were many
began
steps in
useful.
between. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the early stuff. I was actually just looking at this the other day because I came across some file when I wasn't looking for it. That it was actually just a picture of my cat at the time. That the file name I had written as like the sleepy cat in the conlang, and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Uh-huh.
So I was looking at it because I wanted to see if that's actually what it meant, and I was looking at the files for translation and stuff. And I mean, it's very straightforward. It's just a list of roots and a bunch of affixes. Like this is an augmentative and this is a diminutive, without any real explanation of like, well, what does that actually mean? Like what do you use these for? Um, but it was very much just like the phonetics of it were more or less English plus a velar fricative, which I feel like is very common.
Yeah.
Um,
For
you
early
know,
ones, yeah, for new
no
language.
specifically defined phonotactics. Um,
Yeah.
and then I sort of began to just read more about that stuff and explore more different sounds, and eventually sort of stumbled across the dichronic method and attempted that, and got very confused by it because suddenly it was just like there's this whole extra side that you need to know all these things about sound changes, and it was very intimidating at first.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point I sort of started branching into where I had a side where I was attempting to do the dichronic stuff with increasing success, many different projects, most of which never went very far. And then also this other side where I was like, I'm going to ignore that and just do some other stuff. And so I have a language, Toal, which is like, I haven't really done much with it these days, but it was basically, I would like to have a complete ish project. It's not going to be perfect or even necessarily very good, but I would like to have something I can translate into because at this point I had been working for years to try to make a language without really
Uh-huh.
having much to show for it. And sort of on that same side is Stefa, which does not, have any sort of internal history or world building, anything like that, like other conlangs that I have do. It just sort of exists as a thing. Um, but it, I seemed to recall thinking that I wanted to do some sort of tonal language, but I wanted to do something unusual with it, which would be to have like almost more tonemes than phonemes, like to have a little bit of like a
Mm-hmm.
small number of phonemes, but like really do stuff with the pitch. And eventually, this evolved into why bother with the spoken part of it? Just make it pitch based entirely. And the sort of I feel like a natural step there is to jump from tone levels and contours to, if it's going to be on an instrument, just have specific pitches.
Mm-hmm.
um and at that point it was sort of like, well, there's so many different ways this could go, and it became a sort of project in narrowing scope because there are so many different aspects to music. Like, I mean, you have pitch, you have rhythm, you have harmony, all these different things. Um, which ones of those are going to convey information, and how will that information be organized? And there are just so many possibilities. And so I kind of knew already that this was probably not going to be the only project like this I was going to do. Um, and I decided for Sdefa that the pitch alone would convey meaning. So anything like rhythm or timbre, like choice of instrument, or even register, like how high or low you're playing, that's all extra stuff. That's all basically free, so that the text itself is just the sequence of pitches, and then if you want to turn it into something musical, you can compose with that. And so everything from that point basically became like centered on that idea. So like any A in Steph is equivalent. So like if I have this note, I think you can hear that, versus this note, those all mean the same thing. I mean, they don't have meaning by themselves. It's just a single phoneme essentially. But there, you could think of them all as like allophones. And there's other
Mm-hmm.
aspects in which I was thinking like I want to convey music, or sorry, convey meaning through music relatively efficiently, but also leave as many parameters open as I can, so that I can turn what would be a jumble of notes into something that sounds nice to listen to.
Yeah, that is something interesting that I noticed, and I watched through your presentation of it, your um conlang showcase of it
Mhm.
earlier, and it does strike me that you're essentially working with a very minimalist phonology,
Yes, absolutely.
because it's entirely within. I mean, you can choose different octaves, but it phonemically it's one octave of a chromatic
Hmm.
scale.
Yep. So that
And
means there's
so,
essentially 12 phonemes,
right,
and a few of them don't even show up all that often, because I'm usually using this to write fairly diatonic music, which is to say it's in a particular key, and any given key does not use all 12 notes for the
right.
most part. You know,
Um
here and
is
there, but
are there
oh, there's
the
Lavuna, by the way, of Lavuna Langs.
yeah, hello Lavuna. Um so if you're writing to a specific key,
Yes.
like, are there ways that you change the words in order to fit that, or do you have to just choose your words in such a way that you minimize accidentals?
So, um, there's a combination there. So part of it is the words themselves mostly fit pretty well into the key of C major and closely related keys.
Mm-hmm.
So, I try to avoid words that have like a lot of C sharp, D flat, same note, which doesn't show up as often in that key. E flat is okay because it belongs in C minor, which is a closely related key to C major, and so it's like I'm making choices, and especially in the contours of the words.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a note that doesn't belong in that key, it moves towards one that does usually. So that if I want to take this word and place it into the C major context, there's usually a fairly obvious way to do that. And then there's also some flexibility built in other parts of the language where even if it ends up somewhere that doesn't quite fit in the key, I can course correct. The
Mm-hmm.
other part is, yes, you can just sort of choose words differently. So I do have, I don't know that I have any exact synonyms, but I have a lot of derivational strategies. So if I want to say like, I mean, so I have like an inceptive or inchoative prefix. So I can attach
Mm-hmm.
that to any verb to mean start doing this, or become in this state. But then
Right.
for some instances, I also have a verb that just means that. So I can choose from those options as well. Yeah.
Okay. That's that is interesting.
And
Um
actually, so, oh, sorry.
no, you can if you got
Sure.
more, you can talk more.
Okay. Yeah, no. So one thing that I didn't talk about in that video at all is that every word in Stefa is a little musical quote of something. So one of the things that I found when starting out was just sort of like, there is a sort of phonotactics in a way, which is this idea of staying in the key of C major more or less. Like I'm not going to jump between notes in a way that sounds totally arbitrary. Like I'm unlikely to have a note that or a word that sounds like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it. I'm much more likely to have a smoother contour, like something like
Okay.
that. Um, but there's still so many possibilities, and it was sort of just like, how do I don't know. Sometimes I have difficulty even with spoken conlangs of just like choosing a route. Like I know people use random generators a lot, and that's something I do sometimes. But for this, the results are usually not great if I'm just picking randomly from any four out of the 12 notes. So what I did was I basically went to music that I know and chose little snippets of it to mean things. And because of sort of where my musical interests are, that means that there is actually a lot of Schubert and a lot of Sondheim, and then a number of other composers, because those are two of my favorites, and I just happen to know a lot of their songs. So if
Oh.
I'm thinking like, oh, I need to make a word for whatever, I can think about, and they're also both very prolific composers, so I can think, oh, well, that idea comes up in this one song by so and so. Let me see if a quote from that could work.
Mm-hmm.
And if that song happens to be in some other key, I'll transpose it so that it fits a little better. So that's that's where I was trying to get to with the transposition will make it fit. So that in the end, a Stefa piece of music tends to probably be in C major, maybe like F or G or some other closely related key,
Mm-hmm.
um, because the words are just sort of naturally aligned with those.
That is interesting, and it does end up sounding pretty good. So you
Thank you.
you are successful in doing that. That's something that I was thinking about when I was making my own like cursed uh cursed um uh conlang musical conlang, which is we'll get to talking about yours because yours is much
Well,
better than mine.
I wanted
Uh,
to talk about yours also, so because
oh,
I watched that and it was very cool. I actually really enjoyed seeing what sorts of choices you made for like solving these same issues that I came across. Like which aspects of the music are going to convey meaning and how
right,
are we going to sort of narrow the scope to something that is like comprehensible.
right, right.
So
Although it was not, I was not necessarily wanting it to sound good, or
right. Well, I think a big difference there, which sort of aligns our two cursed
mhm,
conlangs more with each other than either with Steffa, is that they sort of produce the result. Like it's like if this is what you want to say, this is what it sounds like. Like I mean that's
yeah, yeah,
usually how a language works. Whereas with Steffa, it's sort of like a sequence of pitches alone is not a piece of music. So you still have to add a rhythm or harmony or something if you want to. Otherwise, it's
right.
it's not interesting. So there's still this extra step of composition to go in between um, writing the text and making it into music.
Well, I mean that, and that is also like, so one thing that Steffa avoids that both of us did with the curse conlangs is make words out of chords, right?
Yes, yes,
And that really does restrict you, and it does cause like it causes a lot of like accidental dissonance,
yeah,
which was not necessarily a problem with us. And we'll talk about how you went
right,
even further, making even more dissonance on purpose.
right,
Um, but uh, but like but with Stefa, it's all melody, and you
yes,
can get dissonant intervals in there,
right.
but it's not as but it, since it's a melody,
But
it's
melodic
like
dissonances,
fleeting.
I mean, it doesn't sound the same. I mean, like you can stretch things out and you can add a dissonant harmony to it, so it's always there as an option. But like if you're just talking about a sequence of pitches where
Yeah,
each one follows the last, there's basically no chance for dissonance to
yeah,
happen unless you want it to.
yeah. And the other thing is like with synthlish, I use timbre
Hmm.
very prominently, you don't care about timbre. I had like, you gotta, a
Right.
word is defined partially by which of the synth waveforms you choose.
Hmm.
So like, on either you have to play it on a synth that is set up for you to like switch between the those timbres, or you would have to like replace them with instruments, which I think maybe
Yeah,
yeah,
you
you could probably do
you
like
could
a
get some close equivalents. I mean, if you use like a flute or something for the sine wave, and then something like that. But
yeah, or
it gets a
I
little
think
difficult.
sawtooth would be brass, because sawtooth
Probably.
waves tend to be used for like a brassy sound, but like,
Yeah.
you get
I mean, you have four
you'd have
different
to,
waves, right? Four different
yes.
kinds. So,
So
I mean, you could sort of make a sort of standard substitution of like a woodwind, a string, a brass, and or I guess you could have pitched percussion, but probably not with that. It's something like that, where even if it's not
I don't know what real
particularly
world
close,
thing. I
but
do not know what real world thing sounds like a square wave.
not
It's
much.
it's
Yeah.
a very strange thing. You hear a square wave and the first thing you think of is a Game Boy. It's not a
Yes.
thing.
Yeah. But almost, I was sort of thinking of it almost as like if you wanted to, it's almost like a slightly alternative phonology or a register,
Yeah, yeah,
rather than trying
you
to
could do
imitate
that.
it. Yeah.
But like, but the thing, I'm getting at is with that is like, of course, I'm I that was like part of making it cursed, is like, you're gonna have like these jump scares where suddenly you hit like a sawtooth wave in the middle
Yes.
of a bunch of sine waves, and it sounds kind of horrendous if you don't put a filter on it.
Yeah.
But like with Stefa, the thing is, it is interesting. You, by restricting it to a chromatic scale, and you have the flexibility to choose an octave or even jump octaves, and also the flexibility to add harmonies, and
Hmm.
you could write a piece in Stefa and also orchestrate it with a full orchestra,
Yes.
and it would work fine.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
could do anything you want. You can play it on the piano, you could play it on a violin, you could play it on a synth, you could probably play it with a theremin or something.
Sure.
It
Why
doesn't
not?
matter.
Yeah.
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 Um, but
Since you mentioned the orchestra, there's something that I haven't really gotten into too much, which I plan to, which is having two lines that are in that work together that are both Steffa. Because so far, whenever I've had harmony, it's always been there is a Steffa line and then there's the harmony parts.
uh-huh.
Very occasionally I'll do something where I'll have like a recurring theme in the harmony that is a Steffa word, but it's not in any sort of grammatical context. It's not marked properly.
Uh-huh.
So in one example, which it was for conlang relay, the first let's have a relay, uh, the very opening has this, so it's a duet for cello and viola, and the viola line is Steffa throughout. It's always like that's where the message is, but the cello line
Yeah.
occasionally will join the viola, so they'll be in unison. So that at that point, the cello line is also communicating. But at the very beginning, it's okay. It's playing this, which is the past tense prefix over and over. It's not attached to any verb, but it's sort of the idea was that this is a story that took place a very very long time ago. So the sort of
Uh-huh.
underpinning, the harmonic underpinning, comes from this past tense marking. Um, Things like that, where it would be very cool, and I will try it at some point to have a piece where there's maybe two lines that are both Steffa throughout.
Right.
At that point, it gets much more difficult to make sense of it because you have to you can't stretch things quite the same way. Like
Yeah.
your choices are informed not just by the meaning, but also what will sound nice with the other part. Um, but
it
yeah,
it
that is
it,
a goal.
it would also end up being harder to interpret unless you have like
Yes.
very different timbres for the the two instruments that are talking.
Yeah.
Um,
So that is that is something that does come up sometimes. People will mention like, how is one supposed to understand this? And the answer
yeah,
is kind of, you're not. I mean, it's really, you can think of it as like a conlang whose purpose is to create music rather than
yeah,
directly to communicate. It's not music for the purpose of communication. It's music that happens to communicate something, sort of. I mean, it's obviously not just incidental, but I don't expect anyone to be able to listen to something in Sdefa and be able to understand it, partly because perfect pitch is kind of required, or at least very good relative pitch.
yeah,
Um, it does matter specifically which notes you're playing, not just the contours. Um, and just keeping track of it is very difficult. Like, I know some of the words offhand, and I would recognize them if I heard them, but certainly not all of them. And uh, picking out those words in a stream of notes can also be very difficult.
yeah. And I would say that um, your conlangs don't have to be practical
Yes.
for communication, especially this. I don't know how to classify Stefa. It's sort of artlang. It's sort of englangy in a way,
It
in
is.
that it's
Yeah.
stretching the definition of what a language can be, or using a non-conventional modality. So I would say that it doesn't necessarily need to be practical. Um, you could make a musical language that is more readable, just like David's Copicon presentation.
Right.
He stuck to a pentatonic scale, which is much more easily readable if you don't have perfect
Hmm.
pitch, right?
Yeah.
Um, but you don't have to. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
It's
The
just.
way I
Mhm.
the way I see it is like, with very few exceptions, the vast majority of conlangs are not being actually used for communication anyway. Like, there's Toki Pona, there's Esperanto, there's like a few examples where people
Yeah,
actually do use them to communicate, but for the most part they're art projects, and so why not stretch what an art project can be in this context?
right.
You
I
know,
mean, like if you talk about my D&D languages, the primary
right?
source purpose for those is to write spell incantations.
Hmm.
And the people who are would use those spell incantations don't necessarily need to know what they mean. I
Mm.
now those are meant to be naturalistic, and I do make them so that they could be usable for communication. But depending on your purpose, you don't necessarily have to. And I feel like Stefa, as an art project, as a conlang that is more meant to make beautiful music, it definitely achieves that goal. So it's successful in that way. It doesn't necessarily need to be readable in order
Right.
to like be valid. I like
And
I
it's, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, I was just gonna say it's readable on the page.
yeah,
I actually took a lot of effort to make sure that it would always be comprehensible, as long as some basic music theory and how the language works. You can look at a string of notes and figure out what it means.
yeah,
One issue I ran into early on was, how do you find where a word begins and ends, which in
mm-hmm,
natural languages obviously is not really an issue. We don't divide them up clearly. Speakers just figure it out based on their knowledge of the language. But when you hear a language you don't know, you can't
yeah,
always tell where the word boundaries are. But because there's such a limited phonology, and so much about it is distorted, like the rhythm might be different from one time you hear the word to the next, I wanted to make sure it was clear. And so the key there is repeated notes. So whenever you have two of the same note back to back, that's always, um and apologies to David, that's always a morpheme boundary. So that's always between two words, or between an affix and a root, or two affixes. And because there is also fixed lengths, an affix is always three notes and a root is always either four or five. You can always look at where the repeated notes are and figure out exactly where the boundaries are. So you can sort of figure out the almost the grammatical structure without even knowing any of the words,
Right.
which is kind of an odd thing to think about actually. But yeah. So if you have the music on a page, I mean, I there's some work involved, but you can parse it, I think, relatively easily compared to listening to it, which obviously is going to make that much more difficult.
And while you can write it in musical notation, you also
Yes,
have two other writing systems that,
I
like,
do.
I presume if you learn those, they might even be easier to parse than the musical notation
So
because
actually, for the first uh time I well, so it was that same relay I was talking about.
Mhm.
Um, I did not know how much the person following me in the relay would know about music notation, so I actually presented it only in one of those orthographies. I did not present the music notation at all.
Uh-huh.
And I basically explained, I explained enough about the music in the relay documentation, but uh, they were able to figure it out just from the orthography and that explanation. So that works too. The orthography, both of them in slightly different ways, are oh, what is the word for when orthography doesn't convey everything?
Underspecified.
Yeah, I guess so. So I guess that's actually not even quite accurate. They show everything you need to understand the text, but they
Hmm.
don't tell you all that extra information like rhythm, harmony, anything like that. It's just basically the information about the string of notes.
Yeah.
It's not a notation you could use to actually convey music to someone.
Right.
It doesn't even tell you all the exact pitches necessarily. It tells you enough of the exact pitches and the contours where that's the only relevant part. So yeah.
Yeah. An interesting thing um, that I noted was you chose to have, what is it, 27 different third person
Ha, yes.
inflections. And it works sort of in a similar way to ASL, where, like, in ASL, the way I understand it, like, you can sign um, a word or a name, and you assign it to a place, and then you could refer back to that place. It's kind of working in that way, in that you're choosing third person suffixes, and then when you want to agree with that particular noun, you put the same suffix.
Yeah, exactly. I hadn't thought of that connection, but that makes a lot of sense. Um, the I think the place I came to that from. So, uh, actually, since we were talking about conlang collaborations before, another conlang I've been very interested in for a while is Unnels, which is a collaboration between Alex Fink and Psy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a lot of inspiration from that language in Sdefa, despite the fact that Unnels is purely graphic, non-linear 2D writing system,
Yeah.
and Steffa is musical. But there's
Mm-hmm.
actually a number of things, and that's one of them. So this one of the ideas in Unnels is that um, almost everything is technically a predicate. So there are no true nouns. There's like, I mean, you could call it a verb. It's not really a verb, meaning to be a mouse or to be a person or something like that. And the stuff that is like noun like is connections between those.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you were to write the sentence like um the mouse is small, you're essentially writing a verb to be a mouse and a verb to be small, and then the line that connects them is the thing that shows that those two things are connected, and you can connect in any arbitrary number of things to that same line.
Right.
It can branch as it needs to. So I was sort of thinking of the same idea where these um, essentially pronoun suffixes are like those connections. So you have your verbs or nouns, which are distinct in Stefan, but both take these pronoun suffixes, the agreement suffixes. And if they have the same suffix, then they must refer to the same thing.
Right.
So there are, um, you said 27? Is that right? I have to double check the number, but there are 36 possible suffix forms the way that I define them, and a
Uh-huh.
number of them have some fixed meanings, like first person singular, first person plural, etc., interrogative, and then however many are left over, and that number has changed a little bit because I have restructured a few things. Those are all just freely available, and you can choose whichever one you want.
Uh-huh.
Um, so essentially, what the process of writing, what I'll do is I'll come up with the basic structure of the text. Like I'll sort of do it in a gloss first, and then I'll figure out which notes are actually fixed, which notes are in the roots, and then these suffixes end up being like connecting material. And so I will pick those to connect the bits of music to make them sound right. So like if I want something to be have a very linear sound, I might choose, you know, as one of the suffixes so I can connect from one word to the next. But then every other time I need to refer to that noun or agree with that noun, I use the same, stepwise suffix. Um, and that's another place where flexibility is built into the music, so that even if you have to use a word that maybe doesn't quite fit in the key you're in, you can surround it with bits of material that will make sense out of it,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Um, so what it ends up being is you essentially have these 27 or so suffixes, which I also sort of think of as almost like ad hoc noun classes because of the agreement. It's kind of maybe not the best analogy, but like you assign each noun to its little class, which is that suffix, and then every time a verb refers to that noun, it has to agree for subject or object.
Why did you go with a chromatic scale and not like a diatonic scale that you could just like pick a key for?
That's a good question. I don't know that I ever considered a diatonic scale.
Hmm.
Um, I think I think well, for one thing, you have more possible phonemes with a chromatic scale because you get 12 instead of 7 or 5 in the case of a pentatonic scale.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a little bit more freedom. Your words will tend to, they can be a little bit shorter
Mm-hmm.
um, on average. Um, I I don't remember where along the in the development of the language the idea of having each word be a quote came in, but that really only works if you have the full range of notes to work with,
Okay.
unless you pick your quotes very carefully, because you know um, many pieces of music are not so strictly diatonic.
Right.
Um, and then I mean I don't have perfect pitch exactly, but I have something very much like it where if I hear a note in a reasonable range, not too high, not too low, and on an instrument that I am familiar with, I can almost always tell what pitch it is. So for me, it sort of just made sense to use absolute pitches rather than matching a scale. So I
Okay.
think it was just sort of like to me it seemed like an obvious choice. I don't know that I necessarily considered the alternative, but I do have some plans for a third musical conlang. We'll talk about the second at some point, but for that one, I definitely want it to be more approachable for someone who's a little bit less trained, you know,
Mm-hmm.
for picking up on these things. So it's not going to deal with absolute pitches, and um, probably would be more scale based. So
That's
yeah,
interesting. Let's actually move on because I really actually
yes,
do want to talk to about what it's called, Avenuna. Um,
Amnenas.
Amnenas. Why?
Yeah,
My brain is not working. Amnenas. Okay,
yes.
for the Curse Conlang Circus. So as I'd had the idea for Synthlish for a long time, and I was
Hmm.
excited to do it, but I didn't have a whole lot of time to work with. And then I saw that you were going to do an entry to the Curse Conlang Circus.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, Jonathan is definitely going to do better at this than me
Oh no,
because
I.
because Jonathan is experienced that it, at musical conlangs, and I had an idea that you were like classically trained, so you would know like uh more about
Yeah,
things than me.
yeah, I studied composition,
Yeah.
so.
So
But I mean, one of the things that I found very early on with Steffa is that there's all these questions to answer, and there's so many possible answers, and I
yeah,
feel like um I had to choose certain ones for Steffa. I couldn't put every possible thing I thought of in it, which is partly why I have had these other ideas floating around already for other musical conlings. But I knew that like anyone else making one would also make something very different and very cool. It would not be at all the same, and I feel like
yeah,
it's hard to draw the comparisons because they end up so different anyway.
yeah. Well, when I say that you did something better specifically for this purpose, which is Agmashwa's Curse Conlang Circus. You're supposed to make something that is as torturous as possible,
Yeah,
and
I ended up torturing myself with this one, to be honest.
a language of chords that is in just intonation. I
Yes.
don't know if I could even build something that would play just intonation notes, but, but to actually even do that.
Yeah.
But can you talk about like the decision process in that, and like how you came up with the idea there?
So, just intonation has been an interest of mine for a number of years. It's it's a very big subject, so I don't want to get into it too much. I did not really explain at all what it is in my video because that could have gone on for way too long. But
Possible.
it's a different system of defining pitches where you're using ratios instead of um what how do I even put this? So the standard tuning system has these fixed pitches. There's 12 of them per octave, and each one has the same distance to the other. But because of the way that pitch works and our perception of it um, is not is related logarithmically to frequency rather than linearly, that means that the um, ratio of every note on the piano to the next one up, if it's in tune, is the 12th root of 2. So that when you go 12 notes up, you've doubled. 12th root of 2 to the 12th power is 2, and 1 octave up is twice the frequency. But with just intonation, you're using these simple whole note ratios instead. So 3 to 2, 4 to 3, things like that. Um, which makes certain things sound very nice. And if you limit yourselves to your like very simple ratios, it's very pleasant sounding. But you can just take it as far as you want. You can introduce some very complicated ratios. Um, and because of certain mathy things, sometimes these complications arise when you're not expecting them to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more or less why people don't really use just intonation in practice. Instruments like string instruments, which I play, use some sort of compromise between just intonation and equal temperament, which is the sort of standard tuning system where we're making these pure intervals where we can, but we have to adjust other things. Um, but the idea is that you have essentially this unlimited palette of notes because you can just, any ratio you can multiply and then you can
Right.
go off of that note. So if you're starting from a C, if you define that as, whatever frequency it is, and then you define your G as 3/2 times that, but then you can leapfrog from there. So
Right.
this is something that I just found very interesting from a musical point of view for a very long time. And so
Yeah.
I had the idea to at some point maybe do something with this for a language, and then when the Curse Conlang Circus came up, and one of the themes was I don't remember exactly how it's phrased, but something like non
Non-human
non-verbal language,
phonetics.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I was like, well, maybe this is the time to do this.
Yeah.
So if I had been doing this not for the Curse Conlang Circus, it would have come out very differently, but it would still have been based on just intonation.
Okay.
Uh, if you depending on what you know direction you go with it, it may or may not sound super dissonant. So I could have taken it in a different direction, but because I was making it for this project, I leaned into the dissonance.
Yeah. So um, the what I understand of it is that
Mm-hmm.
most tuning systems, including the most common modern one, equal temperament, make
Yeah.
some compromise for the fact that musical intervals do not actually match up. Um, they're like they divide into each other with irrational numbers, so you cannot
Yes.
actually
Yes. Exactly.
you can never actually get an octave out of these simple whole number um, intervals. And from like if you stay very close, if you stay like within one octave and choose very specific intervals, you'll be fine. But
It. Yeah.
but
Basically, it
but
not
if
so much staying within an octave, but yes.
yeah, but if you start moving too far like up or down, you'll get mismatches where like this is where the octave should be, but we're not going to perceive that as the same note anymore,
Right.
and it's gonna screw things up. And the with Amnenas, the thing that was interesting to me was that you kind of worked it so that to ensure that that would happen because the chords sort of like walk away as
Yes.
it
Yeah.
goes.
So one of the specific inspirations there was this idea in math of the oh, I'm blanking on the name of it. Is it the drunkard's walk?
Mm.
That sounds about right. So it's
Yeah.
basically if you have like some space that you're in and you choose randomly what direction you're going in at any given time, you could end up wandering very far. You can double back, and it's if it's random, of course, there's no way to predict it. But I sort of had this space of all the possible notes, which is infinite and three-dimensional. And I decided, well, like, even before I was thinking of this as a language thing, I was using randomized stuff. I was just randomly generating directions to go in at every step. And you end up with some very crazy notation, even though at any given time, the harmony doesn't sound any more complicated than before because you're moving to a whole new space, but you're not staying in the original space,
Uh-huh.
right? And then with the introduction of the language, it's sort of like the you know necessary bits of grammar and things will drive you in certain directions, but they're not driving in a consistent direction, and they're certainly not consistently moving you back to where you started. So you end up with these very complicated looking chords, which may not even actually be all that complicated. If you look at some of the crazier ones towards the end of the video, you can see that, even though there's like, you know, 12 flats on the page, well, every note has at least three flats and a minus. So if you just subtracted those all, it looks like a much simpler chord.
Okay.
Um, so it's possible to have this be totally pleasant sounding if, again, you choose your words carefully. And in this case, I was doing a lot of sort of sound symbolism where a word that means ruin or destroy, and there were a lot of words like that in this text, was going to sound more dissonant. So in the context of this particular translation, it does end up sounding quite harsh. Um, but if I were writing about something else and I was choosing more consonant chords, um, even though it would look really confusing on the page, it would sound much more pleasant. So at some point, I'm going to put together something like that to show that it's not purely cursed to listen to; it's just cursed to use.
Yeah. I mean
It
that
was truly such a nightmare putting that video together.
yeah, well, I mean the like I saw you talking on Discord, and you had to write a computer program to do it because you can't do just intonation on like a MIDI controller or anything. You just have
No,
to. you have to generate the pitches exactly somewhere.
Yeah. For clarity, I wasn't writing a program. I was using a program called Super Collider, which basically lets you make music with code. So I did have to write some basic code, and I know very little about that, but I learned
Yeah,
for this project just enough to make this happen. So
yeah.
yeah,
I but the idea of you made it so it could sound nice, but this particular
yes,
example did not sound nice. Actually, does jive a little bit with the choice I made with Synthless. If you play Synthless in a major key, you will get some accidentally um some accidental uh dissonant chords still, because you'll get some half stiff intervals. You might,
right.
I think it's still possible to get a tritone in a major key, so you might get that, but it'll sound a lot nicer. But I decided to end the text in the absolute worst scale you could do in the standard Western tradition, specifically to make the point that you can make it sound really terrible if you want to.
Which one was that?
It ended, so the last part of, and I only did the short text, but the last part of the text, I I uh, I wrote it in C sharp Locrian.
Yeah, I was guessing it was Locrian. Yeah, yeah. That's an well. Yeah, that's nasty.
And it doesn't, it still sounds like music though.
Yeah. Well,
Amnenas is um the, with the text that the example that you have um for the CCC actually seems to, like, it's like pushing the boundaries of what can sound like music a lot more.
yes, part of that is because of a bit of time crunch on my end. So my original plan for the main translation for the video was to have a melody and to have the chords that actually convey meaning be a harmonization for the melody. But
Uh-huh.
the process of actually composing a coherent melody where it's the chords themselves that are the bit that carries meaning, it would have taken way too long. It already took a very long time as it was.
Yeah.
So it ends up just being a sequence of chords. And I also did want to lean into the cursed nature both of the language and the text by emphasizing some of the dissonance. So increasingly through the text, so there's still a number of sort of free elements like with Sdefa. It's not octave dependent, so you can aside from which note is the lowest, which carries meaning. You can have each note as many times as you want. You can have them in close spacing or very wide.
Mm-hmm.
So in moments where I wanted to really emphasize that, I would put the dissonances in a very close spacing, which emphasizes them. It makes them
Right,
sound even
right.
more dissonant. Whereas if you have, if you have a minor second in your chord, but you're allowed to move them apart, if you move them to the opposite ends, it almost doesn't sound dissonant at all. So I, at various times, chose to emphasize and de-emphasize that. Also with
Mm-hmm.
timbre and volume and register. So when I wanted to really emphasize something, I used much lower bass notes, higher treble notes. Although I didn't want to go too high with those because it didn't sound great with the system I was using.
It,
Um,
yeah.
and various or it was just a low pass filter, but with various cutoffs to mellow out the sound a little bit more or introduce a little bit more harshness to it.
Yeah. that that is smart that you had the flexibility to open or close the chords. That's something I didn't actually have control of, because I
Right,
decided I you're sticking to two octaves, and which octave you're in actually carries
right.
meaning.
That's all. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is interesting how we came to, like, different decisions on what to do with
Mm-hmm.
all of the tools that we have here. But I will say one thing I absolutely will say if you win the fourth Curse Conlang Circus, Z-Way will have to write the weirdest music they have ever written.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know. I don't know if you can do anything in Serum with that.
I honestly do not know how I would do this with any program other than the one I used. I used to use a different one, which is no longer supported on like recent operating systems. So I like had to learn a new program in order to make any of these sounds. It was certainly not something I was going to try to play. It's impossible on a piano. It is possible, but extraordinarily difficult on a viola or violin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm sure there's other programs that can do it, but I don't know them.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. And if
Hmm.
you have more music from this, it will be interesting. Um, but anyway, I think that's. I think we're kind of coming up on time.
Hmm.
But yeah, check out Lavuna Langs, everyone. Um, do you have any particular other things you want to plug or anything?
Um, So, just to be clear, Laguna Lynx is on YouTube and also Tumblr,
Mm-hmm.
um, Blue Sky, but I don't really use that very much. I also sometimes appear on Let's Have a Booba. I am often there for their scripting episodes.
Right.
Um, so I that's something that we didn't really get into too much except at the beginning, but I really love doing scripts for conlings. It's like one of my favorite parts of the whole process. Um, I have a lot of posts about that on my blog on
Yeah.
Tumblr. Um, that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any like parting words of wisdom or anything?
Um, I mean, I think I would encourage conlangers to explore different modalities for conlangs. I think I've had a lot of fun doing musical conlangs in two different ways now. I'm going to continue that in the future. I've dabbled in some other sorts of modalities too. Um, and you know, I think the idea, I think more people should make musical conlang specifically too, because regardless of whether you think that someone else might do it better, it's there's so many spoken conlangs and people like the new one, even though all these other ones already exist, right? So
Yeah.
there's so many ways to approach it and so many possible creative solutions that no two people are going to arrive at the same ones, and there's a lot of variety possible, and that means that there's a lot of really good musical conlangs that are possible. So I'd like to see some more of those.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. It's it's very like I don't know if I've seen anyone try to use rhythm in a musical conlang.
Yeah,
Uh, you just,
it's
both
on my
both
list
of
of things for the next one.
yeah, both of us actually like left that flexible and like
Hmm.
oh gosh, I did it so like I will say I tried to import my MIDI into MuseScore to make musical notation out of it, but my MIDI that I did in Reaper was so messy that it would take forever to like try to clean it up so that
Oh
MuseScore
yeah.
could turn it into like proper new musical notation. And then going the other way, I just didn't have time to. So
Mm.
it's like, yeah. But anyway, yeah. There are a lot of different tools that you have with music. Um,
Yes.
I would love to see someone do layers of like melody in like Sdefa or something like that that is also sung with words in another language.
That is near the top of my list for things I want to do in Stefa, which
Yeah.
would be have some song where meaning is conveyed both through the words and the music, and you can really have some fun with playing around with, are those two meanings the same? Do they complement each other? Do they contradict each other? How are they related? It could even be like a dialogue
Yeah.
where one speaker is the voice and the other, or the words, and the other is the pitches. Like, there's so many cool things you could do with that.
Yeah. And you could even layer it. You could build a chordal language and put that in as the harmony. You could do a lot of things
Hmm.
trying to like have those layers of actual meaningful stuff involved. But anyway, thank you so much for being on, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.
And I look forward to seeing more of your musical conlangging projects and hearing more Sdefa. And well, with that all said, thank you all out there on YouTube for watching. Go check out Levuna Langs and happy conlangging. Thank you for listening to or watching Conlangery. I produce this podcast once a month for all podcasting platforms and as a video version on YouTube. On the YouTube channel, you can also find my weekly Tongues and Runes live streams where I am creating languages for Dungeons and Dragons players, and occasionally some solo conlang tip videos. Planning on doing more of those. If you'd like to support what I'm doing, I have a Patreon where you can get early episodes, exclusive polls, and notes for Tongues and Rune streams. You can also, for only $1 a month, get your name at the end of each video, just like the fine people here. Since this podcast goes out on audio as well, let me read the names out. Minerva, Connor Stewart Rowe, Kenan Kigunda, Nye, Tabby, Soten, Viren Patrick, Sylvia Sotomayor, Kay, Alex Russell Hayes, Jesse, Alexis Hugelman, Tinguish, R. Table, Paul Roser, Miles Ronkovich, Jake Penny, Artifexian, Nicholas Norblad, Eloy Variana Mentaleum, Sigourney Hunter, Daniel Quigley, Graka Grunk, Grammar Antifa. Our theme music is by Null Device. Conlangery is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License.